online, on the TuneIn app,
and on your smart speaker.
Play Shock Radio.
This is the sound of Salford.
Shock Radio News.
It's just gone 7 o'clock, and this is the Shock News Show with Alfie Mulcahy, Alfie Garner and Noah Buckingham-Reed. Your headlines: Donald Trump says he has imposed global tariffs, including on imports from the EU, because they don't take American cars. This is all while Downing Street says there'll be no immediate UK reaction to the higher taxes. The US accounts for 8% of Britain's total steel and iron export market. Meanwhile, the US president claims he has a team of officials on their way to Russia right now as Moscow considers an American proposed ceasefire in Ukraine. It's been accepted by Volodymyr Zelensky. A former bishop has been jailed for more than 4 years for sexually abusing a boy he christened as a baby in Swansea. 84-year-old Anthony Pearce pleaded guilty to 5 counts of indecent assault against an under-16, dating back to the late 1980s. A thief has been found guilty of murdering an Amazon delivery driver who'd clung to the side of his van as it was being stolen. 42-year-old Claudie Carol Condor died in Leeds last August. And Michelle Keegan has revealed the birth of her baby girl, Palmer Elizabeth. She's the actress's first child with her husband, Mark Wright.
Shock Radio weather.
Scattered showers will become more isolated throughout this evening, but with a few wintry flurries are still possible over high ground, turning mostly dry and cold overnight with lows of 2 degrees. Well, this is your Shock News Show on Wednesday, the 12th of March 2025 with Alfie Mulcahy, Alfie Garner and Noah Buckingham-Reed. We are starting today with the story of the cargo ship and the tanker which crashed yesterday. An oil tanker carrying 220,000 barrels of jet fuel collided with a cargo tanker in the North Sea on Monday, just off the coast of East Yorkshire. Both vessels erupted into flames after the crash about 13 miles from the shore. The fire on the tanker continued to burn well into today. One crew member of the Solong container ship is presumed dead after a search and rescue mission for him was called off on Monday night. A 59-year-old who was the captain of the Solong and a Russian national has been arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. 36 people were brought ashore after the collision and one was taken to hospital. Alfie, Noah, what else do we have on this? What more information can you tell us?
Well, we know that the oil tanker was called the Stena Immaculate. It was sailing towards Hull under the US flag. The Solong was under a Portuguese flag. The alarm was raised about 9:48 a.m. HM Coast Guard responded at 20 past 10 in the morning. And the ship tracking website Vessel Finder shows the tanker had departed from a port in the Peloponnese region of Greece and was heading towards Hull while the Solong was sailing towards Rotterdam.
And we saw that this ship, which came out towards the Stena Immaculate, was seemingly stationary as the Solong sailed towards it. The tanker was operating as part of the US government's tanker security program, and a group of commercial vessels that could be contracted to carry fuel or for the military when needed. So the actual cause of the collision remains unknown, as this ship was stationed up before, I think in the few days before, and it was collided into essentially while in the sea. We've seen that the Detective Chief Superintendent Craig Nicholson from Humberside Police said the force has launched a criminal investigation, adding that extensive work has already been carried out.
And we've also heard from environmental experts. They've shared their concern over the reported oil spill, with Greenpeace releasing a statement saying it was monitoring this situation. Paul Johnson from Greenpeace UK says it's hard to tell what the environmental impact will be.
Jet fuel is quite toxic material. Hopefully most of it will evaporate, but that won't be true of the fuel oil if that escapes from the ships that have been impacted by this. So we don't know enough yet to fully judge this incident.
And it's not like both vessels are running on petrol like you'd find in your car. They're running on marine gas oil or heavy fuel oil. We don't know exactly what each of them are running yet, but they're both far dirtier kinds of oil, far heavier and far more disruptive to habitats. Martin Slater is from the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and he said if pollution enters the Humber estuary, it could be devastating for the wildlife, including important fish stocks.
Cyanide, fuel, plastics burning, that will eventually hit the sea surface or land, and that's toxic, to all marine life. Nature is already under threat, and this kind of thing can be really catastrophic for wildlife.
And guys, we've seen before with stuff like this, we've had big oil spills, that the companies behind the vessels have tried to distance themselves from what's happened, putting a lot of the blame, as we saw in spills. There was one off the coast of Mexico last year, where the company was trying to pin the blame on the captain of the ship and not taking collective responsibility. Do you think that companies with these big vessels are kind of taking advantage of the environment a little bit?
100%. They've definitely taken the view that we need to transport big, vast pieces of equipment. Usually it's cars in these cargo ships. Other times it's other vehicles. But so what they've done is they've taken that aspect and kind of gone, well, if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have your car or you'll be able to ride the bus. So they kind of use that aspect, but also they can't really blame each other to refuse responsibility. They then go into sort of fight and flight mode where they're like, we need to save ourselves before we save what's happened within the past few years. So it will definitely come down to both sides blaming themselves. But I think the common thought at the moment is both are to blame. One for being docked in the middle of the ocean, and one for they didn't have a choice, but potentially lessening the impact.
I think we understand there's poor visibility, so I think these things are going to be pulled on, and we've seen it in the past about how these companies are able to pull on these external factors to try and avoid the blame of the consequences of what has happened to their ships. Of course, these things are highly adapted. We don't know all the details yet, but the Stena Immaculate, for example, was carrying jet fuel. That is highly potentially toxic to the water around it. We know that the Salong was carrying 15 containers of sodium cyanide, I think was mentioned by one of the environmental advocates that we heard from. That's another highly toxic chemical. A lot of this combination, and it's not the first time we've seen oil spills, and especially in the North Sea. I think what now needs to be done is a collective responsibility and a proper investigation here on what can be done to perhaps reduce the risk of toxicity on these ships, but also in the general responsibility of human life and of injury and of valuing the people on those ships as much as the whole economic trade factor of it.
And what we've heard in the last few minutes is that the Salong had previously failed safety checks. It had a PSC, that's Port State Control inspection, in July last year, showing how officials had warned that the ship's emergency steering position, communication and compass reading was not readable. So that's part of the ship's navigation system. There were 10 issues recorded during that PSC assessment last year. So it really does kind of call into question where Stena liners, how much they are to blame in this, and whether it was a technical fault rather than an act of negligence on the captain's part.
Well, there's that argument as well. Is like, if there was known to be issues, obviously there seemingly is, 10 issues in one report kind of suggests that boat should have been decommissioned and sort of taken away, get those issues fixed promptly, and ensure that the maintenance sort of resumes over the next few months to kind of prevent these issues from continuing. So it's clear potentially that was not happening, and sort of routine maintenance wasn't happening as often it should have been.
And what does that say about our regulations that we have on the North Sea? What has been already understood sort of by environmental experts is that this could easily affect sort of protected marine life areas like the southern North Sea area, the Holderness offshore marine protected areas, and these include not just sort of the sea life, but for seals and seabirds around these areas, which are often we see around the coastlines. And we even heard how this potentially could get towards the water, to get towards our shores. This is something which needs to be heavily regulated. And the fact that we had boats which potentially should have been decommissioned, allowing to dock up in inconvenient places, in dangerous conditions, where we heard that there was conditions which were foggy across in terms of weather conditions, and also in the conditions of these ships. I think it definitely needs to be looked at in how we now look at our North Sea and protect our wildlife and our sea life.
Yeah, absolutely. And the leader of Hull Council, Mike Ross, he's called for the government to set out a rapid response plan to this incident. Yesterday, the Minister for Aviation, Maritime and Security, Mike Cain, gave this update to the House of Commons.
Modelling suggests that, should the Salong remain afloat, it will remain clear of land for the next few hours. The assessment of His Majesty's Coast Guard is, however, that it is unlikely the vessel will remain afloat.
That was the Minister for Aviation, Maritime and Security, Mike Cain, speaking in the House of Commons yesterday. We're going to stick with Westminster now as we talk a bit about Reform UK and all that's happened there over the last week. Rupert Lowe, the Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, lost the party whip over the weekend, meaning he will now be sitting as an independent in the Commons. The Met Police have also launched an investigation into an allegation of a series of verbal threats made by a 67-year-old man, and we now know that to be Rupert Lowe, and those happened between December 2024 and 2025. He was suspended from Reform on Friday over the allegations, and responding to the police statement, Rupert Lowe said he had instructed his lawyers, who have made contact with the Met, and made them aware of his willingness to cooperate in any necessary investigation. Nigel Farage has said that that Rupert has dented Reform's unity, but wrote in the Telegraph external that it would have been inconceivable not to take action. And Benny Fidamore, he's been looking into this a little bit further, and we have this from him now.
So essentially what's happened is Rupert Lowe, a Reform UK MP for Great Yarmouth, was elected at the last general election, has been suspended by the party. He's alleged to have bullied 2 members of female staff at his parliamentary office, and he's also being accused of threatening or directing physical threats towards the Reform UK chairman, Zia Youssef. It comes just days after Lowe criticised Farage's leadership, almost describing him as a messiah and saying that Farage acts like he is the king of Reform UK and nobody else can run it, and any threat to his leadership needs to be shut down. It comes after Lowe has been linked to that leadership role, and also after Elon Musk praised him and said that he would make a better leader of Reform than Farage. So at this time, Reform are leading the poll, a lot of the UK polls. Electoral calculus think they'd win 192 seats should a general election be called tomorrow. And this is kind of a case of some people are saying, well, is Farage scared of Lowe? Is that why just after this article's come out, he's been suspended, these allegations have been brought up? Or is it genuine? Has he genuinely bullied people? Has he genuinely issued the threats? And this is why they're having the investigation. But yes, Farage, is it a sign of cracks in his leadership? And is it a sign of Reform and that momentum kind of breaking down?
Benny Fidamore there. Shock News regular. Rupert Lowe's also hit back at Reform. He said that he'd raised issues about the leadership the day before, and that is the real reason why he's been expelled. It's been just 8 months since the election, and we've already seen the Reform 5, the big Reform 5, go down to the Reform 4. When you guys heard this over the weekend, what was your initial reaction to that?
Well, you could have seen it coming, eh? 8 months ago, we saw the Reform insurgents, the big insurgents, which just resulted in 5 seats for Farage's party. And now, since then, we've, of course, seen some clash of egos. We saw Ben Habib leave just a few months ago. And now Rupert Lowe, who has become quite the figure of the online right in the last few months. And he's become absolutely empowered by the fact that he had Elon Musk's backing. And has contradicted with Farage on a few things. Perhaps maybe this blow-up was maybe waiting to happen in a way. We saw that there was support for him from the online right, and we saw that there were disagreements. But I think what happens now is sort of a battle on the truth here, on whether Farage is praised for the line of taking sort of the duty of care line, which he has taken, or whether sort of the Reform base decides to follow through the guise of Rupert Lowe into more of the further online right sphere, I'd say.
Exactly, and it comes down to this whole thing of both the polling that Reform's had is starting to go up and down. It's sort of wavy at the moment. It's currently second against Labour, but we're also hearing that a third of Reform UK voters feel like it would be better under another leader rather than Nigel Farage. So we're kind of seeing this split within Reform of whether or not Farage should lead like he did in the election, because before the election he wasn't leader, and then a few weeks beforehand he was made the leader. He was the honorary president of the party. But we've also seen yesterday is a Sky News interview with Rupert, and he said he's keeping his options open whether or not to join the Conservatives or a new political party potentially in the future. So we're not seeing him say anything about Reform necessarily, but he's not exactly saying no to joining a different party. We're also going to, it does, you said it there, the online right capture onto Rupert Lowe because he's attracted that base. Will that continue into the future? Will we see the likes of Musk on X continue to support Rupert Lowe into either creating that new party or joining one that already exists? It'll be something to track, but it's definitely a concern for Reform because they've had this electoral powerhouse sort of thing over the last few months in terms of polling. It's starting to sort of come down and stop being as prominent as they used to be.
If these allegations and this investigation comes to nothing, do you think we could be seeing the end of Nigel Farage as leader of Reform, or do you think he's quite, or do you think he's sitting pretty where he is at the moment?
I think it's quite surprising. I'm not sure we'd ever, maybe 8 months ago, look at Nigel Farage as being seen as the establishment figure. But I think what the Reform base have picked up on here is that Nigel Farage is the establishment figure. He is the man who is very connected within Parliament. He's a man who's always wanted to be a politician. He was attempted to be elected 8 times in a row. This time he's made it in, and now I think he'll do anything to latch onto that power and really climb to the very top of this movement. A people's movement, maybe not anymore. Maybe this is what the Reform base are now going to pick up on. He then has hired a King's Counsel to look at this. The police have been brought in. And if this is an ambush, essentially, an unfounded ambush on an MP, if this is the state of Reform UK with 5 MPs, how can you expect Nigel Farage to be the one to lead a up to 200 MPs? It'll be a governmental party. This is what his aims are. And I think there is real now question over whether he's now the one to do it.
I think it also brings in, so obviously we've heard that a third of them, of the Reform voters, want him to be replaced. But also he has got already those connections with international allies and international leaders. Whether or not it will mean that he continues to be a leader is something that will have to be pulled into question by both Reform members and also the parliamentary group. It does show how he responds to this will be a big indicator on how he survives in the party. Absolutely.
And the other 3 Reform MPs, one of them is obviously their chief whip, which was kind of laughed at by some after the election. Why does a party of 5 people need a whipping structure? But we've seen here that
clear now.
Yeah. Do you think if we see Rupert Lowe joining potentially a new party, potentially moving to one of the others, do you think we'll see any of the other core 5 moving across, or do you think they'll stick with Farage?
I think they'll stick with Farage in the short term. I think the fact that they got elected on a Reform seat, I think they don't want to risk that in the future. I think they would want to stay in the party, see how it turns out for the next few months. If it turns out that the party's slowly getting worse and worse, they'll probably hedge the bets and move to a party like the Conservatives. But also we need to remember that the Conservatives were kind of hammered in the last election. They need as many votes as they can get to try and be a good opposition to Labour. If that means having 5 more MPs or 4 more MPs, because I don't think Nigel Farage would give up with the Reform movement, it could be vital for even the most basic of vote. The potential is it will be Nigel Farage and Richard Tice to stay in the party, and the other 2 potentially go to the Conservatives.
Yeah, just on that, I think we've seen that there has been, if any praise on the response, there has been a united front on this. None of the other MPs have particularly spoken out against it. We saw Lee Anderson side with Farage quite quickly. We saw Richard Tice on Sunday with Laura Kinsberg defending Farage and sort of backing the idea that Rupert Lowe's sort of actions were happening over time, and protecting Zaid Youssef, actually, which I think could have been easily one of the ones on the chopping block, a big donator to Reform, but perhaps now not necessarily needed. They've got a big stack of membership here and lots of money coming in, so maybe he could have been the one on the chopping block. It looks like Reform, if anything, are going to be united on this, the rest of them.
Yeah, and a final note from this. The BBC went and spoke to constituents in Great Yarmouth, which was Rupert Lowe's constituency, and in Clacton. Lots of people have come down in favour of Rupert Lowe. Lots of Reform's core support base, with one woman saying that she would be praying for Rupert Lowe, another man saying that in this country people are innocent until proven guilty and that Nigel Farage has acted too early. We're going to move on now to some international news, and Ukraine has agreed to a US proposal of a 30-day ceasefire, with President Trump saying it's now up to Russia to accept the deal. This follows talks in Saudi Arabia yesterday between Washington and Kyiv officials. Trump is also going to invite Zelensky back to the White House after their Oval Office row last month. As we heard during the headlines, Donald Trump has said he has representatives going to Russia right now as we speak to discuss the US proposal of a Ukraine ceasefire. He's also said hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia. That would be 80% of the way to getting this horrible bloodbath to end. And he said that during an Oval Office meeting with the Irish Taoiseach. Guys, we've been chatting about this for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Do you think we're finally getting a bit closer to peace between Russia and Ukraine?
100%. We're getting to a point where, especially if the US is on board with this, I think this is the main thing. The US is on board, who in the past have supported Russia. They've in the past restricted weapons giving and intelligence sharing to Ukraine in order for you to kind of push Ukraine into this. So we're getting to a point where we're getting close, to this ceasefire. Whether it will be a lasting one, we'll have to see. The whole point of this 30-day ceasefire, though, is to try and get a deal between Ukrainian and Russian representatives for a lasting ceasefire in the two countries.
And again, I mean, it doesn't even go without saying at this point that it's been another bumpy week in the US, and of course with these negotiations. But what it does seem to suggest is that the US have finally decided on what the facts are here. They decided that there is an aggressor and there is a victim here. And what they did earlier in the week was actually put on... it just promised to put on sanctions once again onto Russian oligarchs and onto the Russian state, essentially. I think what they want to do is make sure that Russia comes to the table. And we've heard about Trump's ambitions for a peace prize, and of course there's that. But of course, he is maintaining of his relationships here. What I think Trump wants is to bring Russia to the table by any means. It shows that he does, perhaps not on a moral basis, but on a basis which he wants to get to a peace deal. What it has done is almost bring him back on side and hopefully give a little bit of an easier ride to the European leaders who have been pushing this narrative for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and we heard last week that the US had stopped sharing weapon supplies and intelligence sharing. That was restarted yesterday in response to those ceasefire talks. The Kremlin said today that they're awaiting details from Washington about the proposal. The hope is that after the 30 days, further talks would occur regarding a lasting ceasefire between those two countries. We've heard from the Turkish president. He's called Ukraine's acceptance of the 30 days ceasefire as positive and important, with the Polish Prime Minister saying that the UK saying that Turkey didn't want any more bloodshed, and the UK Defence Secretary John Healey has said the pressure is now on Putin. Well, we're going to hear from Marco Rubio now. He said that there's no military solution to the conflict and is hoping for a positive response from Russia. He's also suggested negotiations about Western sanctions against Moscow as part of the new peace deal.
I think it's self-evident that for there to be a peace at the end of that process, there's going to have to be some decision made by the Europeans about what they're going to do with these sanctions and so forth. And so that's why I think they have to be necessarily involved in this regard.
And Ukraine's president has said that talks with American officials have been largely constructive. He says he wants to use these next 30 days to draft a permanent peace deal, which could include a security guarantee.
Everything depends now on whether Russia is willing to do so, to instill truce, or it is rather willing to continue killing people. Everything depends on this country today.
And the UK exports hundreds of millions of pounds worth of steel to the US. Apologies about that. Yes, sorry. On tariffs that America has been putting on the rest of the world, Keir Starmer visited the White House last month. Trade was high on that agenda, and the Prime Minister spoke in the Commons earlier today after failing to secure an exemption. He also said he is disappointed to see the tariffs coming into effect.
I'm disappointed to see global tariffs in relation to steel and aluminium. But we will take a pragmatic approach. We are negotiating an economic deal which covers and will include tariffs if we succeed, but we will keep all options on the table.
Now, both we've seen cost of living in America has been going up and up since these tariffs have been put on Mexico and Canada. They're now stretching further. Do you think Americans are starting to sort of doubt the president's commitment to bringing down the cost of living?
Perhaps, maybe. I mean, I think there is an inherent cult-like figure of Trump that the way he frames it is a transitional period for the economy. He believes that this is something that needs to happen, a measure that needs to happen. He refused to rule out a recession. And I think what he wants to make the people, the American people believe, is this is a transition to a place where America no longer needs to rely on those allies in the immediate. But in the immediate, while they still rely on those allies, it is going to hurt. It is going to hurt. And of course, that's what he's going to want to say. But it just increasingly seems more and more ludicrous to cut off your closest trading allies like this in such a brutal way in which the trade war just escalates. It's highly sort of stoking tension and stoking retaliation, which we've seen from Canada on electricity. And we've actually seen that they perhaps have more that they agree on than they disagree on, because every time he comes away from a talk with a Canadian or a Mexican leader, he seems to come back with a new idea of what the tariffs will be.
I mean, it comes a few days after Canada's now got a new Prime Minister. So we'll see how the shift between the Justin Trudeau and the new one sort of implements and impacts the tariffs talks between the two countries. But so we're seeing talks continue. I'm going to say the EU leaders are now highly talking about whether the tariffs can be sort of fixed and changed between the US and the EU. The UK Prime Minister says he's not going to get involved with these simply because he thinks he can produce a better trade deal with America.
And Trump is now kind of getting a taste of his own medicine. Canada is going to impose around 29.8 billion of retaliatory tariffs on US exports from Thursday. Canada's Finance Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, has said. Later on Wednesday, Trump said he was, of course, respond to the retaliation, so he'd respond to the response, and he's repeated his warning that he planned to impose reciprocal tariffs on countries across the world. He's also not happy with EU trade policies, citing concerns about legal penalties it has recently imposed on Apple, and new rules he claimed would put US farm product and cars at a disadvantage. This is obviously something we'll come back to over the next few weeks. It's been dominating the show for a few weeks now, but we are going to end with a look at today's headlines again. And Donald Trump has promised to impose counter tariffs on the EU after bringing in a 25% tax on steel and aluminium imports. The president has also hit out at the European Union for not buying American cars. The UK has also been hit by the changes, with Sir Keir Starmer saying all options are on the table. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has claimed officials from the US are currently heading to Moscow as the Kremlin decides whether to accept a 30-day ceasefire proposal in Ukraine. The UK Defence Secretary says work is accelerating to create a coalition of the willing to supply troops if a peace deal is agreed. A 20-year-old man from Cardiff has become the 6th person to be arrested after a 40-year-old woman was shot dead in South Wales. Joanne Penny died in Talbot Green on Sunday. A rail union is calling for e-bikes to be banned on the London Underground. ASLEF says it's after a cycle burst into flames on Rayners Lane 2 weeks ago. And a bomb squad was sent to a beach only to find a suspicious object was in fact an upturned saucepan. A cordon was put in place on Charmouth Beach in Dorset on Monday.
Shock Radio weather.
And a look at your weather. Scattered showers will become more isolated through this evening, but a few wintry flurries are still possible over the higher ground, turning mostly dry and cold overnight with lows of 2 degrees. You have been listening to the Shock News Show today, Wednesday the 12th of March 2025, with myself, Alfie Mulcahy, Alfie Garner and Noah Buckingham-Reed. The Shock News Show is produced by Luke Jones and today was directed by Josh Bingham.